Hi, everybody. As you know, there's been an extraordinary deluge of news, and there's one story that I've been meaning to talk to you about for some time now. I'm glad that I can do it today. The Indian state has mounted a massive counterinsurgency operation against the Maoists. In fact, Home Minister Amit Shah has said that India will be rid of the Maoists or Naxal insurgency by March 31st, 2026. He reiterated this claim just a few days ago. Take a listen.
31/3/2026 ये देश नक्सलवाद से मुक्त हो जाएगा। और मित्रों, मैं फिर से बात विश्वास के साथ दोहराना चाहता हूं, जिस तरह से सुरक्षा बलों ने पराक्रम किया है, हमारी सूचना एजेंसियों ने सटीक रणनीति बनाई है, हमें लक्ष्य को सिद्ध कर कर रहेंगे। और आज मैं छत्तीसगढ़ वासियों को कहकर जाता हूं कि हर बार बारिश में नक्सली थोड़ा आराम कर लेते थे, इस बार बारिश में भी हम उनको सोने नहीं देंगे और 31 दिन के लक्ष्य को हम आगे बढ़ाएंगे।
So there won't be any let up in these operations. Already hundreds of Maoists have been killed. So what is at stake here really? Why did the Maoist conflict start so many decades ago? What do the local people, mostly tribal Adivasi communities, want at this point of time? How does human rights, law and justice get affected in the backdrop of this operation, this counterinsurgency operation and the Maoist insurgency over the decades? I'm going to discuss all of this with Nandini Sundar, sociologist, professor at Delhi University, author, and a champion of human rights. Nandini, thank you for making time for this conversation.
Thank you for having me on your show, Anuradha.
The Maoist movement and what they've been fighting for and how they've been fighting has played out over the decades, and it has played out with successive Indian governments, both at the central level and at the state level. And irrespective of parties and ideology, the Indian government and state governments have been opposed to the Maoists, and the Maoists have been opposed to the Indian state.
Yes, but in a very different way from the way it is now, because, you know, both in Telangana, Andhra, in Andhra, I'm going to call it Andhra because it was then undivided Andhra. The Maoists had huge support from the people at large, right? So there was a period in 2004 when, during the elections, peace talks were on the agenda, and the Congress government won because, among the other reasons why they won, was because they said they would engage in peace talks. And when the Maoists came out for peace talks, they attracted crowds of, lakhs of people came to their meetings. So it wasn't just that, they were opposed to the government. They have periodically also engaged in peace talks or wanted to engage in peace talks. But if you look at earlier documents, there was a 2008 committee of the Planning Commission which looked into the whole issue of why the Maoists were there and the causes for popular support. And they said, it's underdevelopment. So Maoists were always treated as kind of misguided people who had taken the wrong path, but for the right reasons. Previous governments recognized that there was an objective socio-economic problem and that the Maoists had taken up arms for the people, and they were not seen as, as evil in that sense. Now, over the years, we've seen from 2005 onwards, the government has been sort of engaged in propaganda while it has been conducting its campaign against the Maoists, and now they have reduced them to purely terrorists. So you no longer hear anything about the socio-economic root causes of the movement. You don't hear about, what issues the Maoists have taken up. It's all about just terrorism and how they have to be wiped out militarily. Like, there's no possibility that there could also be other ways of dealing with this issue, that it's not just a security issue, that it's also a developmental issue. And that the Maoists have been also asking for peace talks now.
The situation right now, we heard in February, earlier this year in February, the Home Minister, put down this sort of declaration of a deadline that India will be free of Naxal and Maoist insurgencies by March 31st, 2026. And prior to that, and definitely subsequently, there has been a massive mammoth counterinsurgency operation that we've seen. There are reports that about 300 Maoists were killed last year, and already in the first 5 6 months of this year, we have the same equal number being killed, and who knows what else. So what is the situation right now in the current battle? And clearly the Maoists are at the weakest that they have been, given this kind of onslaught, and their leadership seems to have been affected. Basavaraju, the general secretary, who's a key leader, was killed recently. So what is the situation right now in this conflict?
But the situation right now is that, as you said, about 500 people have been killed in the last 1.5 years, including the general secretary of the movement, a number of central committee members, Politburo members. So, a large chunk of the top leadership of the movement. So the government is just on an all-out offensive. The Maoists, on their part, have been asking for peace talks. They've issued some 5 letters asking for peace talks. And the government has not responded to any of them. They say that, the Maoists can surrender if they want, and they have a rehabilitation policy. Now, the problem is that the government rehabilitation policy has various rewards that they have listed against top Maoist leaders down to the lowest cadre. And they offer these rewards if you bring in a Maoist, dead or alive. Right? So there is no incentive to bring in any Maoist alive, because then you have to share the rehabilitation and the reward money with them. And so even if they have been captured or arrested or in any way, then it's makes more sense for the security forces to kill them, right? And that's what's been happening. So, for instance, one of the top women leaders, Renuka, who comes from Kadevendi village. Kadevendi was a village in Telangana which was active, in the Telangana armed struggle and continued to be active. So there are these, different kinds of histories which weave into something like this. So Renuka was ill. She was living in a village for 2 months, and she was captured from the house that she was living in. She was living as an ordinary civilian and shot in cold blood. And, they could easily have arrested her if they'd wanted to follow the law. Similarly, with Basavaraju, now we don't know exactly how, once, according to the Mao's account, he was captured alive and then killed. Police say that he was shot, whatever. But the point is that they did not even allow his family to take the body
Yeah, I was reading that
back.
Malini
So
Subramaniam's
that is
report.
actually
Yeah.
a kind of completely inhuman act, because why penalize the poor parents or relatives of these people who haven't seen their children for 40 years, 50 years, and all they want is one last glimpse of their family member. So one reason that people are saying is because if these bodies are taken back to, or even if the ashes are taken back to Andhra or Telangana, then a lot of people gather for these funeral processions, and that will show how they have popular support, and put a lie to this idea that they're all just terrorists. I mean, if the government wants, they can anyways ban processions. So that was also not a reason to deny the family members the bodies. Then they also have security camps every 2 or 3 kilometers, right? So, which have come up on village common lands, and local villagers really want these gone, right? Because they're intrusive. I mean, basically, you're living in a large cantonment. Now, the problem is that if the government agrees to peace talks, then they'll have no reason to get rid of these camps, right? I mean, they have no reason to keep these camps. They'll have to get rid of them. Whereas if they finish them off militarily, there will always be like some remnants of Maoists. After all, how can you control everybody picking up? Anybody can pick up a gun and say that we are Maoists, which is what is happening in Jharkhand. There are all these fake Maoist groups who work with the police. Sometimes when they're inconvenient, they're finished off by the police. Um, so as long as you finish something off militarily, then you'll always have an excuse for keeping the camps, because there are always people to mop up, quote unquote. But if you engage in peace talks, then you no longer have that excuse, because anybody who's then still using guns will be just an ordinary criminal. They will not be a Maoist, right?
If people were to hear this and read, some of the reports that we are getting to access, um, the Maoists have also been guilty of violence. They are guilty of, I remember in 2010 when Mr. Chidambaram was the Home Minister at Dantewada, and some 76 CRPF men were killed. We had the entire Congress party leadership wiped out. We have so many instances of minors being recruited, violent means being used, and local people, local populace being controlled, often by Maoists using violence. So why should the government, why should the Indian state want to do a conditional peace talks? Why should they offer that, given that this is war, this is a war? And today the Maoists are asking for peace talks because they are in an extremely embattled, weakened position.
Yeah, I'm very glad you asked that because, yes, the Maoists have committed a huge number of atrocities and they have lost a lot of popular support because of that, which is why you also now see a lot of people, whether it's because they're being offered these huge rewards or they just want to be safe, they are betraying these leaders. And there are a lot of police informers. There's a lot of money going into police information, but there's also lack of popular support in the way there used to be earlier. But the reason why the government should offer peace talks is because the government has also, I mean, the Maoists have been involved in a lot of killings. There is no doubt about that. But the government has also been involved in a large number of killings. I mean, the Salwa Judum, where the government, the BJP government, supported by the Congress, went and burnt a huge number of villages. Their own documents said that 644 villages were affected. We have a list of about 500 people that we had submitted to the Supreme Court, and repeatedly the court had also asked the government to, you know, uh, prosecute people, register FIRs, which the government never did. So there's been a lot of bloodshed and killing on both sides, right? And in other countries where you've had similar kinds of insurgencies, say in Peru or Guatemala, El Salvador, Colombia, this situation has finally been resolved through a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in which all the deaths have been accounted for. And then there have been some conditions laid down by the rebels or by civil society groups among the affected population, saying that one of the conditions for peace should be justice for all of these people, something on land rights, some acknowledgement of indigenous or Adivasi culture, etc., etc. Right? I mean, there are lots of various issues that people have. If you look at also the Maoists in Nepal and their resolution with the government, right? So, if you want a lasting peace, because after all, people supported the Maoists for all these reasons, like land and forest related issues, right? So, we do want a resolution of those issues also, not just, you know,
Right.
it's not just the Maoists, but these issues still remain. And currently, the thing that people are most worried about is mining, because private mining is coming in a big way, outsiders settling in the area, completely transforming the demography of that area. And people are just worried that if the Maoists are finished, which is one thing, but the camps stay, then they're going to, if people protest against mining and being displaced by mines, then the camps will be turned against them. That's the biggest fear right now. What next after the Maoists when the mines come in?
What about the people who seem to be caught between the Maoists on the one side, the Indian government, successive Indian governments on the other side? What about the people? Can they weigh in? Can their voice be heard? Does it stand? Does it get counted at all in this current situation and a post Maoist situation, which is what seems to be that we are building towards, given this kind of ultimatum and this deadline and the way in which security forces are going all out to end Maoists?
I think local people do want to be heard. They have been asking to be heard in many ways for a long time. But every time they protest, they are criminalized. For instance, there's been this youth movement organized under the name of Moolvasi Bachao Manch. I mean, it was basically local village youth who were educated. This was a generation after the Salwa Judum generation, and they decided to, fight for their constitutional rights. So they've been protesting about camps coming up on their village lands. They've been protesting against extrajudicial killings or encounters, demanding compensation, and demanding all their constitutional rights. So if you look at their literature, you look at their dharnas, they're entirely peaceful. They've been asking for PESA, Panchayat's extension
Yeah.
to Scheduled Areas Act, the Forest Rights Act. And this year they were all arrested. The Mulvasi Bachao Manch has been banned under the UAPA. I mean, the first notification banning UAPA, banning the MBM, the
Mulvasi.
Mulvasi
Yeah.
Bachao Manch, said that they were being banned because they were opposing government policies. Now, since when has opposing government policies become a ground for banning anybody? Like, if you protest against displacement or having security camps come up on your common lands, like, since when has that been a constitutional ground for banning anybody? So all our rights are then suspect, right? Because if just opposing government policy is a ground for banning, then all of us could be arrested
Yeah.
in that sense, right? Villagers would come to these dharnas, sit there for a long time. So they were expressing their demands. Now, police claim is that all of these were Maoist inspired. Now, everything in that area can't be, question is, what are they doing? Were they doing anything illegal? Were they doing anything that is unconstitutional in demanding their constitutional rights? So I think that's one clear avenue where the government is showing that it's not interested in listening to people's expressing themselves constitutionally. Now, you
In
say you
terms
don't
of
want,
what they want for that, if in terms of what
yeah,
they want for themselves and that region.
yeah, exactly. And if you look at all their demands, their constitution, I mean, it's something that the government should have encouraged, because if you're saying the youth should not side with the Maoists, then you should encourage them to be part of these constitutional movements. You should not jail them when they are openly, overground. They were meeting all the MLAs. I mean, it wasn't at all, they were trying to go to Raipur to meet the chief minister,
They
all
were
of that.
working within the system. They were using
Absolutely.
everything
Yeah.
that the system offers in order to get
Yeah.
their voice heard, is what you're
Yeah,
saying.
exactly. So, some commentators have been saying this is part of a united front tactic, and this was just a Maoist front. But whatever it was, even if it was, this is something should be encouraged, right? I mean, to be engaged in peaceful struggles instead of joining the Maoist armed struggle. So, this is, a really unfortunate development. The second is, you have the government recently raided Manish Kunjam on a Tendupatta case where he was the complainant. I mean, he complained about a Tendupatta scam, and then they raided him and took away his phones. Again, he's been a vocal critic of the government and its mining policies and the way it's displacing people. So they're clearly not interested in talking to anybody. Even there's a peace committee which was set up in Hyderabad, and there's now an All India Peace Committee. They're not interested in talking to them. As for people, if you actually talk to people in the villages, it's a much more nuanced kind of feeling. On the one hand, yeah, they're relieved that this violence may be finally over. The attacks by both sides, etc. But because the Maoists were such a regular presence in their villages, and they were almost the de facto government, they're going to miss. They feel that they
There'll be a
already
vacuum.
missed that.
There'll be a vacuum.
There's a vacuum, right? So they said that a lot of. I was talking to somebody in South Chhattisgarh, and they're saying that uh, there are a lot of boundary disputes between villages which have come up over the last 2 years. Earlier, these used to be settled by the Maoists, who originally helped
Yeah.
people settle in these areas. And in fact, if you go along some of these areas in Kishtaram and others, there are like white flags along like a row of white flags which mark the boundaries between each village, which the villagers and the Maoists had set up so that everybody was in their own place.
So why won't the state government and local government be able to fill the vacuum, Nandini? What am I missing here?
They won't, because they're not interested in doing that at that local level, because The Maoist movement was, in a sense, rooted within the villages, right? The government is not rooted within the village in the same way. What they were doing was also like helping people. If somebody, like a widow, didn't have cattle or didn't have household labor to, um, look after her fields, etc., then they would get other villagers to do it. So there was a communal labor system. Now, government is not entering into social relations in that way, right? Women who felt that they didn't want to get married would run off and join the Maoists. Now, that's not something that the government is engaged in, all of these social activities. Secondly, even if you look at the government's claim that they want to bring in, um, schools and health and development, that
Development, yeah,
development,
development.
right?
Yeah.
So if you look at the roads that have been built, they're all kind of major highway type roads, which are connecting mining sites to markets. They're not focusing on the village roads, which people have been asking for. If you look at the condition of schools and health services in these areas, again, that's not something that the government has focused on. So, for instance, in Raughat, which in 2009, this is a hugely biodiverse area in North Bastar in the Kanker, Narayanpur, actually in that Antagad region. And there are 22 CRPF camps, or I think it's BSF camps, which surround that mining area. And the permission was given on the grounds that they would, build schools for people to educate them so that by the time the mines came into operation, they would be able to, um,
Be
you know,
employed in some
right in
fashion.
that. So the school has not begun at all. The only thing that has begun is like a boundary wall. Instead, the mines are there, the railway lines are there, everything is there, and people have been arrested. The villagers have been on a dharna demanding jobs in the, and demanding against being displaced. And even that they're not interested in. So we would have understood if the government had started schools and health centers, which the Maoists also never opposed, right? In all of these areas. But they started security camps instead. And the schools came, much, much later. In fact, we had a Supreme Court order in 2010 saying that security forces should vacate all
Schools.
schools and restore them to the educational authorities. But it took about 10 years for the government to restart schools in all these areas where they had been taken away in during the Salwa Judum period. So, it's really quite clear what the government's priorities are, and it's not schools and health, which is what local priorities are. Schools, health, employment.
I know that several people, including you, you've written about it. I was reading your piece in the Wire last month, saying that a ceasefire is essential. Peace talks should be conducted. Um, Others have also called for this. The government has not paid heed to any of it. What do you see between now and March 31st, this deadline that keeps getting reiterated every time the Home Minister speaks? And there is such clear, a sense of accomplishment that it is under this government's watch that this decades old insurgency will be dealt with in a kind of full and finally settled.
I mean, yeah, it may be dealt with militarily in the sense that you can kill off a lot of people, you can kill off the leaders, but the questions for people remain, right? I mean, right now, even if the government finishes off the Maoists, does that mean that local protest against mining is going to be finished forever? Does that mean that if any time people are going to protest against mining, and these are mining leases which are actually going to destroy a lot of what is sacred to local people, apart from, you know, their environment, like the Beladala mines, which have been going on since the 60s. If you look at the mining townships, Kirandul and Bacheli, and compare it to the villages outside, I mean, they're these little enclaves of outsiders, and the villages outside have nothing really. Uh, they're still very poor. They have red water from mining effluent. So, are you saying that then any future protest will? How will you classify that? Will that the government can no longer say it's Maoist, or will they say that it's Maoist and we didn't finish off the Maoists? What are they going to say? Or are they just going to, repress that in any case? So that is people's main issue. Like, how are we going to defend our land in future? There's also huge demographic change that's happening. A lot of outsiders are coming in, um, buying land benami. If you look at Jagdalpur, which used to be a reserved seat and it got de-reserved, now the only people who will ever win from there are Marwadis or upper castes of some sort or the other, or somebody who's supported by them. So that's going to happen increasingly in other regions also.
Where does that leave the largely tribal population that inhabits a lot of these regions, especially in Bastar?
But it leaves them very worried about their future. I mean, nobody that I met, I was just talking to like a cross section of ordinary villagers, was uh, confident. I mean, the way that Amit Shah seems to think that having finished off the Maoists, there will be paradise in Bastar. Nobody thinks that, right? People are worried about what's going to happen with these camps there, what's going to happen when the mines coming in, what's happening when all their lands are being taken by outsiders. So those are the things that people are deeply worried now.
You mentioned PESA in passing, which is this law enacted, I think, in the mid 90s. Why has that? I mean, does the state, is it a deliberate omission not implementing this law the way it was envisaged?
Absolutely, because this Panchayat's Extension to Scheduled Areas Act 96 gives gram sabhas, or the village community in Adivasi areas, in fifth schedule areas, the right to consent to any, or not consent to anything that takes place on their land, right? So if you are going to have a mine, or a security camp, or even a school or anything, you have to ask the village community first. And clearly the government is not interested in implementing that. And also, they have the right to protect their local culture, and if you're going to bring in schools and hindutva and a whole lot of other things, then you're not recognizing that right.
So we have a law that could actually solve some of the answer some of the questions and address some of the anxieties that people have, but this law is not going to be implemented. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely, and it hasn't been implemented. And the Supreme Court had looked at it in Niyamgiri as well, saying that it should be implemented. But um, I mean, that was part of why the Niyamgiri, the Vedanta mines there was stalled. So it's not like the laws in this country don't exist. We have laws against, we have the fundamental right to life, right? But the government, when it killed off all those people in Salwa Judum,
Yeah.
it just ignored it. It's not, and they've still not got any recognition, any justice. People whose
Yeah.
villages were burnt have not been compensated. Um, so the shortage is not laws, but the political will to implement them and to be held accountable when they don't implement them.
You mentioned Salva Judum several times so far in this conversation. You had a PIL which was disposed of in May without acknowledging or redressing or offering justice to the massive human rights violations that were documented during the time of the Salva Judum and what it then metamorphosed into. You want to tell people, you know, as briefly as possible, not fair to say briefly given what it is that this you've documented, but what did Chhattisgarh go through with this Salva Judum vigilante force, and what are the kind of questions that have still not been answered, justice that still has not been delivered by the Indian state, and now the Supreme Court has said your case doesn't exist anymore, like it's done, they've disposed it of.
So what happened in 2005 was that the government, the police, the local Chhattisgarh police, told various people that if they didn't come to these anti-Maoist rallies, they would be fined, their villages would be burnt, and um, they would summon a whole bunch of villages and take them to burn other villages or force them to come and live in government controlled camps. Now, during this whole process, they basically distributed arms to civilians and also arrested a number of village level sympathizers of the Maoists who were called Sangam members, gave them arms and said, now you go off and fight the Maoists. So in
So
that
they
process
turned
also,
people against each other. They turned local communities against each other. Is that something that
that
happened
was,
besides the
yeah,
violence and
that
the?
was one part of it, that
Mm,
they armed civilians and
mm,
said, you go off and fight, because this is something that, if you're going to fight Maoists or fight anybody, you have a official paramilitary force that does it, right? You have CRPF or whatever. You don't just like recruit people off the
mm,
streets and say, chalo, chalo, join us in this fight. And uh, so it did turn people against each other, but it was also kind of violative of the principle of state, control over an efficient security force and
yeah.
so on. So it's like what they're doing in Manipur right now, right? Like supporting Arambam Tengol against, like,
Mm,
when they looted the police stations, etc. There was no effort to catch them back, or it was basically the government supporting one section, encouraging them to be vigilantes, and against another section. So there was a lot of human rights violations, a lot of rapes, a lot of killing, etc. So we filed in 2007 a PIL. There were two parallel PILs, one by local residents, one by three of us from outside. And we had two main um, kind of prayers. One was investigation into all the human rights violations and redress for that.
yeah.
All those people who were forced into Salwa Judum camps should be enabled to go home. Villages which had been burnt should be rehabilitated, all of that. The second was that you can't arm civilians and you can't use them. So at that point, they were called special police officers, and they were given 1,500 rupees a month or something and given guns. And uh, so we got repeated orders from the court saying that, file the government should file FIRs against all these human rights violations, etc. And um, then in 2011, we had an order from the court saying that the state cannot support Salwa Judum, cannot support vigilantism in any shape, form, by any name called, that they had to disband SPOs and remove, like, not use them in counterinsurgency operations. Now, the government of Chhattisgarh passed a law immediately the next week saying that from the date of this judgment, we will absorb all of these existing SPOs and call them armed auxiliary forces and send them off on
The same.
counterinsurgency operations.
Right. Right.
So we filed a contempt in that, and there's a lot of um, material which says that if you don't remove the basis on which a law can be passed, if it removes the basis of the problem, like if the Supreme Court has pointed out that something is unconstitutional, you have to redress that and then pass your law. You can't just pass a law in order to defeat a judgment.
Yeah.
'Cause-
Yeah.
So contempt was one part of it. One part of it was the human rights violations. Now, what the court, this bench had come determined to dismiss it because they barely heard us for 15 minutes. So basically, they said that this Chhattisgarh government and the union have to take specific steps for peace and rehabilitation. So they acknowledged that there was a human rights problem. But what we had been in court for all these years is not just an acknowledgement that there is a human rights problem, but some concrete steps to do something about it, right? Because the government, the court has repeatedly told the government do something and it doesn't do anything. So where are people supposed to turn then?
So this has
So this
gone
is,
on from 2007 right up to May 25.
yeah, yeah. So they have not, we've been asking for a monitoring committee, which they refused to
Mm,
do. And the second was they said you can't file contempt when the government passes a law, which is, okay, a legally debatable point, which they should have heard our counsel, but they didn't actually look at any of the judgments we provided or anything. But if you look at the situation today, what Amit Shah keeps saying is, the biggest success of their counterinsurgency operation is what are called the District Reserve Guard, which are
mm,
basically surrendered Maoists who are now absorbed into the police force. So if you look at, say, Basava Raju and the killing there, right? Some of his internal team,
Yeah.
the team that was supposed to protect him, betrayed him and became part of the police
Right.
operations. Now, up to a week ago, they were wanted criminals according to the police. Now, those same wanted criminals have been absorbed into the police
Yeah.
force, and the cases against them don't get dropped. I mean, sometimes they get dropped if the government, I mean, mostly they don't get dropped. So we actually have people in the auxiliary forces who are named for murder,
Yeah.
etc., etc., by the police themselves. So we have police who have been indicted for murder, killing other people who are also being indicted. I mean, killing
Yeah.
Maoists because they are claiming that they are murdering. So this is actually legally a really problematic area, because there are cases where people have officially surrendered,
Yeah.
but the cases against them don't go away. So after several years, they can be put back into jail.
Right.
So that means all the DRG are kind of bandua mazdoor to the police, because if they don't agree
Right.
to be part of the counterinsurgency operations,
There
they
is a
will be
sword
arrested.
hanging over their head in
Exactly.
any case.
And that means we
So,
also have a whole bunch of police who are actually criminals in the eyes of the law a week ago. They were
right.
wanted people a week ago.
So this is the impact on the systems and the law and order system, and that's on the one hand. And on the other hand, you have the fact that there is no justice for all the crimes documented and the human rights violations that happened during the time of the Salwa Judum. So there are these two
Exactly.
parts to this.
Yeah.
Nandini, where what you see going forward? Because I have heard several people, ask for these peace talks. It's fallen on deaf ears. Anybody who has shown any sympathy or an open mind to dialoguing with some of these concerns that you have articulated, of the people of the region, of some of the Maoists who represented some of the legitimate, needs and of the people. Um, People in urban areas, intellectuals, people who have an understanding of this have been discredited. We saw a very concerted effort to discredit anybody who has an alternative point of view on these issues. Urban Naxal became that, the term that was coined to refer to anybody who had an open mind to this and perhaps was even sympathetic to some of the larger causes that came up. So what is the role that you could play? What is the role anybody who feels that this is not the way a state, and with a constitution like India, should deal with its citizens?
I guess our role is to speak about it, um, to side with people when they face problems, because the Maoists don't represent Adivasis. Nobody represents Adivasis. They represent themselves whenever they are engaged in anything. So some Adivasis may be Maoists, some Adivasis may be with the RSS, some may be with other political parties. I think it's important to recognize that uh, when people have genuine problems, which they do, they have problems with malnutrition, they have problems with land rights, that these are their own genuine problems, and these are not cooked up issues invented by the Maoists. So even if you're a member of the RSS, you still may have problems with your land being taken away, right? And we do have cases of that where it's not even as if, like, just because you're going to be a BJP supporter, your land is not going to be taken away by Maoists, by mining. So I think going forward, we have to ensure that there's justice for all these decades of killings, whether it's killings by the government or killings by the Maoists. We have to fight for some degree of accountability, because we can't let people disappear into some void as if they never existed. So that's one aspect, to keep accounting for the fact that officially this government had a rule of law, we had a constitution, and we have to follow that. The second is to recognize people's genuine problems and take these up in whatever forum possible. And people are going to continue to fight. I mean, I am not or mobilize or do whatever they want to do. I mean, Adivasis are not just going to like, okay, now the deadline is over. Now we will just give our land to the mining companies, right? I mean, they are not going to do that. So, what is the government planning to do? Is that why all the camps are there? I mean, they must explain to us why they will
Why
have
the
to have.
camps
They're
continue?
saying we're
Yeah,
going to keep those camps there beyond the deadline. Why?
yeah. Nandini, I just want to tell people that if they want to understand more about this, there's your book. I think you should tell them the name. Also, your blogs, the blogs you write, and you've written about the case, and it's very, you've laid out the context, you've laid out the legal issues that this case has, brought up, and where it leaves, what you set out to do, what your original prayers were. So I'd like people to read that. I'm going to put that up. Thank you for making time for this. We'll
Thank
keep
you.
talking. That's the least we can do, to engage and to keep talking and to try and understand what's going on. Even sitting hundreds of kilometers away from these areas and these people who are all Indians, isn't it?
Thank you, Anuradha. I would like people to read my books, both The Burning Forest, India's War on Bastar, and also my earlier book, Subalterns and Sovereigns, which talks about the historical context for these land and forest issues much before the Maoists came.
Thank you,
Thank you
Nandini.
so
Thank
much.
you
Yeah.
for making
Thank
time.
you.
Yes.
Bye bye. Thank you.